The snow was merciless, my horses had no shelter, and then he appeared,
Come with
looking
me.
at me as if I mattered, and said, "Come with me." The wind tore through the bare hedgerows like a scorned spirit, rattling the brittle branches and carrying with it the bitter scent of snow and earth. Eleanor staggered along the frozen path, her skirts soaked and clinging to her legs, her fingers numb beneath gloves that had long since lost their warmth. Tonight, the world seemed intent upon cruelty. Tonight, the sky itself had conspired against her, blanketing the countryside in a relentless flurry, and she could think of no shelter for her horses, her sole companions, trembling in the icy wind beside her. She had walked this road 100 times, but never had it seemed so treacherous, so unkind. The village lay behind her, distant and judgmental, its windows lit by flickering candlelight where whispers of her widowhood, her misfortune, her perceived folly, danced like shadows along the walls. Her heart quivered, not merely from cold, but from the weight of isolation. The death of her husband had left her bereft in more ways than one. The small inheritance he had left was insufficient to mend a roof over her stables, and the villagers, though few of them outright cruel, wielded gossip as sharp a weapon as any blade. Eleanor had long learned the art of bending beneath their glances, of lowering her voice when a passing woman paused to pity her, of standing straighter when the men, shivering from wine and bravado, offered knowing smirks. Yet tonight, in the endless whiteness, all her practiced composure faltered. The snow, powdery and merciless, clung to her cloak, to the wisps of hair escaping her bonnet, and the horses stamped impatiently, their breath forming fleeting clouds that mingled with the wind. She knelt beside them, pressing her hands to their flanks, whispering soothing words that seemed swallowed by the night. "Steady, my loves. We shall find warmth. We shall endure this." But the sound of her own voice only reminded her of how alone she truly was. Her chest tightened, grief pressed upon her with the weight of winter itself. How many nights had she walked these frozen paths, tending to the animals, and yet never imagining she might survive them alone? Every creaking branch, every groan of the trees in the tempest, felt like a judgment, a reminder that the world did not pause for sorrow. She thought of her husband, his face now a ghost beneath the snow, a memory as brittle as the ice beneath her feet. He had been kind, though sometimes distant, and his passing had left a hollow in her soul that even the loyal comfort of her horses could not fill. The wind carried away her muffled sobs, scattering them across the landscape like seeds of despair. Eleanor's vision blurred. She fought the urge to sink to her knees, to allow herself the relief of surrender. And yet, even in the throes of hopelessness, a part of her, stubborn, fierce, defiant, refused to yield. She would not let the cold, nor the world, nor grief, extinguish the ember of her dignity. Then, faintly at first, she heard the distinct sound of hooves cutting through snow, steady and measured, different from the jittery stamping of her own herd. She froze, pulse quickening, heart half expecting a predator or a scornful villager. But the rhythm carried purpose, a quiet authority that unsettled her and intrigued her in equal measure. From the white haze emerged a horseman, tall, cloaked in dark fabric that absorbed the dim light like a shadow made flesh. His presence was commanding, yet his approach was careful, almost reverent, as if he sensed her fragile state without a word spoken. Eleanor rose slowly, clutching the reins of her largest horse, feeling both fear and an inexplicable curiosity. The figure drew closer, and she glimpsed the faint outline of a coat embroidered with subtle, noble insignia, a crest that spoke of lineage, of wealth and status she had long resigned herself never to touch. Her breath caught in her throat. The man dismounted with surprising grace, boots crunching through the snow, and lifted a gloved hand in a gesture both cautious and assuring. "You cannot remain here," he said, his voice low but resolute, cutting through the wind like a warm blade. "The storm will not relent, and neither can you endure it unassisted." Eleanor's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. She had long been taught to distrust the wealthy, to expect judgment or indifference, not benevolence. And yet, something in the tilt of his head, the steady calm of his gaze, disarmed her. He stepped closer, but never so near as to alarm her, his gloved hands resting lightly against the saddle of his horse, a silent acknowledgment of her companions. "I am passing from my estate," he said, careful with each syllable. "But I cannot in good conscience leave you and these animals to the mercy of this night. Allow me to offer warmth, shelter." Her lips parted, not in reply, but in stunned acknowledgement. Could a stranger, a man of rank and unspoken authority, truly offer such kindness? It seemed impossible, inconceivable, and yet the sincerity in his voice resonated in the marrow of her bones. She glanced at her horses, their eyes wide, seeking protection in her presence alone, and felt the crushing weight of responsibility and the desperate need for relief. Her pride wavered. She wanted to refuse, to insist on her independence, but the frostbitten ache in her fingers and the despair pooling in her chest overpowered stubborn pride. Finally, with a tremulous nod, she said, "I cannot ask such a thing, sir. It is not proper." The man inclined his head ever so slightly, a flicker of a smile in his eyes, acknowledging her dignity even as he defied the rigid norms of propriety. "Proper, madam," he replied, "is often a matter of perspective. Compassion, however, knows no bounds." Eleanor's heart fluttered, a timid bird against her ribs, as she glimpsed the faint glimmer of hope, a warmth foreign yet exhilarating in the frozen night. And in that moment, as the storm howled and her body shook with cold and grief, she felt the slender thread of possibility weaving through the desolation, that perhaps, for the first time since her loss, she might not endure the world alone. Her mind raced, considering the consequences, the gossip, the propriety, but the storm pressed upon her, relentless and unforgiving. She looked once more to her horses, trembling in the drifts, and knew that no moral hesitation could justify leaving them to perish. Slowly, carefully, she extended her hand, not in submission, but in quiet acceptance. Then, "I shall come with you," she whispered, voice raw yet resolute, carrying more dignity than she herself had expected. The Duke inclined his head, a silent acknowledgment, as he guided her toward his waiting horse, the snow swirling around them like a sea of white uncertainty. And in that silent, suspended moment, Eleanor felt the world shift, not with certainty, but with the fragile promise of sanctuary, of warmth, of a life yet to be written, as the shadow of the storm pressed closer, and the distant lights of the manor remained unseen, hidden beyond the drifts. And as they began their careful journey together, the wind tore through the hedgerows once more, louder now, as though questioning the audacity of hope. Yet Eleanor walked beside the Duke, not in fear, but in cautious trust, unaware that in this fleeting act of surrender lay the first brush of a destiny that would change everything she thought she knew about loneliness, courage, and the power of a single, fleeting act of kindness. The door to the manor swung open with a gust that sent a shiver through the hall, carrying the scent of burning oak and waxed floorboards. Eleanor stumbled inside, her skirts heavy with snow and mud, her cheeks flushed not from warmth but from the sudden, dizzying intrusion into a world she had long believed closed to her. The Duke followed, a silent sentinel, guiding the trembling horses toward the stable with practiced hands, his eyes flickering toward her now and then, assessing, careful, protective. The horses, sensing the solidity of his presence, calmed under his touch, their breaths rising in clouds that mingled with the warmth of the stable's lanterns. Eleanor watched him, her pulse uneven, struck by the quiet authority he wielded without arrogance. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to offer some token of gratitude, yet the words tangled in her throat, leaving only the fragile flutter of her heartbeat. The manor itself was a place of careful order, every object placed with deliberate grace, every corridor lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her as she stepped timidly through the hall. The servants, discreet and polite, paused in their duties to offer soft glances, their manner acknowledging her presence while signaling their understanding of her precarious social position. Eleanor felt herself shrinking under the weight of their gaze, aware that here, she was a visitor in a world of silk, polished brass, and whispered hierarchies, a widow who had known poverty and scandal, now intruding upon wealth and privilege. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying the rapid rise and fall of her breath, willing herself to meet this unfamiliar life with composure, though every nerve thrummed with fear and exhilaration. The Duke led her to a small sitting room, its fire roaring, throwing dancing shadows against the high-paneled walls. He gestured toward a chair, a simple, elegant piece upholstered in deep crimson velvet, and Eleanor lowered herself onto it with a tentative grace. The snow dripping from her cloak hissed faintly as it met the warmth of the hearth, and she pressed her palms against her lap, willing them to stop shaking. "I trust your horses are comfortable?" the Duke asked, his tone soft but deliberate, commanding care without impatience. His gaze lingered upon her, and Eleanor felt an unaccustomed flutter of self-consciousness. He looked at her not with pity, but with a kind of careful admiration that made her feel both exposed and treasured. They will manage," she murmured, though the statement rang hollow even to her own ears. She had little hope for comfort in the cold night, yet she felt, for the first time since her husband's passing, that someone recognized the effort and love she carried with her alone. The Duke inclined his head, as though acknowledging her courage, and moved to a sideboard where a silver tray held steaming cups of tea. He poured one, the amber liquid swirling like liquid sunlight, and handed it to her with gloved precision. "You must drink," he said. "The night has been harsh, and warmth is required not merely for the body, but for the spirit as well." Eleanor's fingers hovered over the cup, reluctant to touch, yet drawn by the earnestness in his manner. She accepted it finally, sipping, and found the heat spreading through her limbs, a gentle reassurance she had not felt in months. Conversation came slowly, hesitantly, as Eleanor's voice found its strength amid the soft crackle of firelight. She spoke of her late husband, of the small farm she had struggled to maintain, and of the endless responsibility of caring for animals who relied entirely upon her. The Duke listened with the patience of one accustomed to both solitude and command, his gloved hands resting lightly upon the arm of a nearby chair, fingers drumming ever so slightly against the polished wood. He shared, in careful fragments, glimpses of his own life, the suffocating expectations of nobility, the loneliness of estates too large and halls too silent, the weight of duty that left little room for companionship or warmth. Neither confession was complete, yet the exchange itself forged a tentative bridge between their worlds, delicate as frost upon a windowpane yet firm enough to promise connection. Yet the shadow of scandal was never far behind. Eleanor caught herself stealing glances toward the windows, imagining the murmuring villagers and their sharp tongues. What would they say if they knew she was sheltered here, within the walls of a duke's home? Even as gratitude swelled in her chest, a part of her recoiled, wary of the whispers that might follow her beyond the manor gates. And the Duke, perceptive as he was, seemed to sense her unease, though he did not press the matter. Instead, he offered small tokens of reassurance, a woolen scarf folded neatly upon the armrest, gloves lined with soft fur, a quiet hand extended to guide her through icy hallways. Each gesture was deliberate, gentle, a silent acknowledgment of her pride and dignity even as he bent the rigid rules of propriety to shield her. The evening deepened, shadows stretching long across the polished floors, and the wind outside intensified, rattling the panes as if demanding attention. Eleanor found herself drawn to the window, watching the snow drift endlessly, each flake a reminder of the harsh world from which she had been spared, if only for this night. The Duke joined her, a quiet presence behind her shoulder, and spoke in a tone that balanced authority and gentleness. "You possess a rare strength," he said, voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "To care for creatures so small against such merciless forces, it is an act of courage many men would shy from entirely." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, a mixture of shame and pride, for she had never considered her daily labors heroic, only necessary. And yet, in his words, they were transformed, elevated, as if the world had finally noticed what she had carried alone for so long. As the clock chimed softly in the distance, signaling the late hour, the Duke made a small, bold proposition. "The night is far from over," he said, his eyes catching hers with quiet insistence, "and neither you nor your horses should endure it alone. Allow them to rest here, and allow yourself the comfort of warmth. No questions will be asked. No judgments passed. Only sanctuary, and perhaps, some measure of trust." Eleanor's breath caught. The offer was radical, yet simple, and its sincerity left her uncertain whether she should feel gratitude, relief, or the faint stirrings of something unnameable within her chest. She hesitated, caught between propriety and necessity, between the learned caution of a widow and the fragile, daring hope of a heart long starved for recognition. Finally, with a quiet resolve, she inclined her head. I will accept," she murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. And in that simple acquiescence, a shift occurred. The walls of her isolation cracked, and though the storm raged outside, a warmth began to grow inside her, a delicate, unspoken promise that not all strangers carried judgment, that not all power was wielded to wound, and that perhaps, in the careful gestures of one man, a path forward might exist. The Duke offered a rare smile, fleeting yet genuine, and gestured toward the stairwell leading to her temporary quarters. As Eleanor ascended, the firelight flickering behind them like a heartbeat, she felt the first trace of hope in many months, a hope tethered to trust, courage, and the quiet thrill of connection. Yet even as the door closed softly behind her, muffling the roar of the storm, a faint unease lingered at the edges of her mind, the whispers of scandal, the judgment of neighbors, the rigid rules of propriety, all waiting just beyond the walls. And somewhere in the hush of the manor, Eleanor understood that the night had delivered more than warmth, it had delivered possibility, fragile, tentative, and entirely new. And in that fragile hope lay the first tremor of change, a shift that promised both danger and delight, waiting for her to step fully into a world she had long believed beyond her reach. The fire leapt higher than ever, flaring with sudden intensity as though the flames themselves sought to illuminate the unspoken truths lingering between them. Eleanor sat rigidly on the edge of a high-backed chair, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the dancing shadows that played upon the walls. The storm outside had softened into a whispering snowfall, each flake drifting silently to the earth, yet the turbulence within her chest remained untamed. Across the room, the Duke leaned against the mantel, fingers brushing idly along the carved wood, his gaze following her with an intensity that both unnerved and intrigued her. The air between them thrummed with a tension neither had yet named, a fragile thread of curiosity, admiration, and an emergent desire for understanding that refused to break, no matter how carefully Eleanor tried to suppress it. "Tell me of him," the Duke said suddenly, voice low and deliberate, cutting through the crackle of the fire like a blade tempered in warmth. Eleanor's breath caught, her pulse quickening at the directness of his request. She hesitated, unwilling at first to give voice to the sorrow she had carried alone for so long. But the room felt intimate, a sanctuary apart from the judgmental eyes and gossiping voices of the world beyond the manor walls. She inhaled sharply, steadying herself, and began in a whisper. "He was gentle," she murmured, eyes flicking to the hearth as though the flames might shield her from the memory. "And yet, fragile. The illness took him swiftly, leaving me nothing but these creatures and this land." Her fingers twisted around the folds of her skirts, and she dared not meet his gaze, fearing the weight of sympathy might crumble the careful dignity she had cultivated. The Duke moved closer, but carefully, preserving the unspoken boundaries of respect. "Loss such as yours is seldom acknowledged properly," he said, his tone carrying neither pity nor judgment, but a rare, resonant understanding. "And yet it shapes a person more than they often realize. Your strength in the face of such sorrow, it is remarkable, madam." Eleanor's lips parted in a faint, startled smile. Rarely had she been praised for endurance rather than appearance, for courage rather than compliance. The warmth that spread through her chest was unfamiliar, stirring both hope and fear. Hope, because someone saw her, not as a fragile widow to be pitied, but as a human being whose quiet heroism mattered. Fear, because recognition came from a man whose world and expectations were far beyond her own, and who could easily withdraw it with the merest gesture. She lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes for the first time fully, and found a depth there she had not anticipated. Beneath the composed exterior, beneath the careful words and measured gestures, was a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "And you, sir?" she asked, curiosity threading through her tone. "I know little of your burdens, of the life you must endure behind the walls of your estates and titles." The Duke's expression softened, as though her question had pierced a shield he had long worn, revealing the man beneath the grandeur. "The world demands much from those born to it," he admitted. "Solitude, duty, the constant expectation that one must uphold appearances while denying one's own inclinations. It is a lonely life, and one often wonders if companionship is a luxury denied forever." Eleanor's chest constricted at the confession, an ache echoing her own isolation. Here was a man bound by society's strictures, yet capable of empathy and recognition of her struggle. She realized that their worlds, though separated by wealth, title, and circumstance, shared a quiet resonance of loneliness, of private battles fought behind polite facades. The conversation deepened, each exchange revealing fragments of inner life, as though they were weaving a tapestry together, thread by fragile thread, careful not to tear what had already been stitched. The firelight seemed to pulse with their words, illuminating features and expressions with a soft intimacy, drawing them closer in a manner neither fully conscious of nor willing to resist. Minutes passed, yet they felt like hours. Eleanor found herself sharing the minutiae of her days, the chores, the care of the horses, the evenings spent alone in the drafty kitchen, the quiet desperation of nights when grief pressed upon her so heavily she feared it would crush her entirely. And the Duke listened, asking gentle questions, never overstepping, never intruding, yet allowing her the freedom to lay bare the contours of her solitude. In turn, he spoke of the rare moments when he escaped the suffocating expectations of rank, solitary walks through snow-covered gardens, the silent company of loyal animals, letters left unanswered in oak cabinets. Each revelation, small and measured, drew them into a delicate intimacy, an emotional closeness as tangible as the heat radiating from the hearth. Yet beneath the growing trust, a current of anxiety pulsed. Eleanor could not entirely ignore the whispers of propriety, the invisible eyes of society that would not forgive a widow for receiving such attentions from a man of title. She caught herself tensing at moments when his gaze lingered, questioning the propriety of desire, of gratitude, of something more profound she dared not name. And the Duke, perceptive as ever, seemed aware of the unspoken struggle, his expressions carefully measured to reassure, never to overwhelm. The dance of restraint and revelation created a tension so exquisite it made Eleanor's heart ache with longing and caution simultaneously. As the hours deepened and the snow continued its silent descent outside, the Duke rose, moving toward the window. He gestured for her to join him, and together they gazed upon the snow-laden estate, the silence between them resonant with the weight of shared experience. "Eleanor," he said softly, the name itself an invocation, "I see more in you than circumstance or title could ever allow. You possess a courage and gentleness that command respect, yet inspire something more, even in me." Her breath caught at the words, a tremor threading through her chest, a pulse of hope tempered by fear. To be seen so fully by another, especially one whose life was so elevated above her own, was both terrifying and intoxicating. She turned toward him, eyes glistening, and for a fleeting moment, the world beyond the window ceased to exist. Here, in this quiet sanctum, stripped of judgment, wealth, and expectation, they existed simply as two solitary souls recognizing one another. Yet as her lips parted to respond, a sudden knock echoed through the hall, sharp and deliberate, breaking the fragile intimacy like a sudden gust of wind. Both turned toward the sound, Eleanor's heart leaping with apprehension. The knock, resonant and insistent, carried the weight of intrusion, of potential judgment, of unforeseen consequence. The Duke's expression darkened imperceptibly, and he moved toward the door with quiet authority, leaving Eleanor suspended in the sudden void between warmth and fear, trust and uncertainty. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and the carefully woven thread of connection trembled, not broken, but tested. The visitor's identity remained unknown, and in that suspended moment, Eleanor felt the first true brush of real danger to the fragile trust and intimacy they had so painstakingly built. And as the door opened just a crack, the wind from outside swirling the last flakes of snow into the hallway, Eleanor's gaze met the Duke's, wide with both caution and resolve, and she realized that the night had shifted once more. What had begun as sanctuary, as quiet understanding, now teetered on the brink of revelation, of challenge, and of the unforeseen trials that must follow the fragile courage of trust. The bells of the manor chimed sharply, echoing through the halls like distant warnings, and Eleanor's heart leapt as if in answer to some unseen summons. The knock at the door from the previous night had left an indelible tremor upon her nerves, and now, in the gray light of early morning, the house seemed suddenly alive with whispers, each creak of the floorboards carrying the weight of anticipation. She moved through the corridors cautiously, her skirts brushing the polished wood, snow clinging stubbornly to the hem, her breath catching with every step. Outside, the storm had waned, leaving only the brittle remnants of frost glittering against the dark earth, and yet the air inside the manor thrummed with a tension far more potent than the storm could ever muster. The Duke was already in the main hall, standing tall beside the staircase, his posture rigid with expectation, eyes scanning the windows as though he sought unseen threats in the shifting light. "Eleanor," he said, voice carrying through the space like a gentle command, "the night has passed, and with it, the quiet must yield to action. It is no longer enough to shelter from the storm. The world beyond these walls will not pause for propriety, nor for compassion. We must act, and we must act with both care and courage." Eleanor's pulse quickened, a heady mixture of fear and resolve, as she followed his gaze toward the main doors. The snow-laden landscape awaited them, an unforgiving expanse that mirrored the uncertainty gnawing at her heart. The Duke extended a gloved hand, not in dominance, but in trust, and she hesitated only a moment before taking it, the warmth of his palm searing a quiet reassurance through her frozen resolve. Together, they stepped into the crisp morning, the cold biting but invigorating, and Eleanor felt the weight of eyes upon her, though none were yet visible. The path led them past the stables where her horses stamped nervously, nostrils flaring in clouds of vapor, sensing the gravity of the moment. The Duke's hand remained near hers, though not touching, a tether of guidance rather than possession. Villagers had begun to gather at the far edge of the estate, their murmurs carried on the wind, curious and sharp, the hum of speculation audible even at this distance. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, the familiar sting of shame threatening to undermine her courage. And yet, she drew strength from the presence of the Duke, from the quiet assurance in his stance, from the understanding that this moment demanded bravery beyond mere survival, it demanded dignity. As they approached the horses, the Duke spoke softly, his tone measured, deliberate. "These creatures are yours, Eleanor, and so too is your courage. But the world beyond these gates will not respect either unless we present them with the dignity they deserve. Allow me to lead, and follow my guidance." Eleanor inclined her head, suppressing the tremor in her voice, and assisted in saddling the animals with a precision born of months of necessity. The Duke's hands were steady, confident, yet always mindful of her space, his presence a blend of protection and unobtrusive support. The villagers had drawn closer now, curiosity turning to speculation, and Eleanor felt the familiar flush of vulnerability, tempered by the knowledge that her actions were honest, just, and necessary. The Duke lifted a hand, calling attention without arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant and calm, "this woman has endured a storm far greater than the one that swept our lands last night. Her courage, her dedication, and her unwavering care for these animals demand recognition, not scorn." Eleanor felt her breath catch, the words washing over her like a tide, filling the hollow of shame that had been carved by years of whispered judgments. The villagers' faces shifted, some in awe, some in reluctant respect, yet the tension remained, a reminder that the world often tests those who rise above expectation. He continued, stepping closer to Eleanor, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You are not alone, Eleanor. Never again shall you bear these burdens without acknowledgement, without sanctuary, without trust. I offer you not merely protection, but partnership, if you will accept it. Her chest tightened, the weight of his words sinking into her heart. Partnership, an idea so alien, yet intoxicating, stirred a warmth that no fire could provide. She searched his eyes for jest or manipulation, but found only sincerity, admiration, and a rare reverence that both comforted and startled her. The horses, now calm under her gentle hands, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Eleanor patted the largest mare, murmuring reassurance, and then turned to face the Duke fully. The wind whipped the edges of her cloak, snowflakes settling on her hair and shoulders like fragile diamonds, and she felt a clarity she had not known in months. I cannot promise the ease of this path," she whispered, voice trembling yet resolute, "nor the absence of consequence. But I can promise my honesty, and my trust, if you will accept it." The Duke's eyes softened, and for the first time, he allowed the faintest shadow of a smile to cross his features. "Honesty and trust are all I have ever desired," he replied, voice low and sincere. "The rest, society, gossip, circumstance, are but clouds we must navigate. And navigate them we shall, together." The words carried a weight that made Eleanor's knees weak, yet her heart soared. In that instant, the storm of judgment, shame, and isolation that had haunted her existence seemed to shift, bending to a new possibility, a life shared with someone who recognized her strength, who cherished her courage, and who would stand beside her against the harsh winds of expectation. Yet even as the promise of union settled between them, a shadow flickered at the periphery of Eleanor's mind. The wind carried more than snow, it carried voices from the village, carrying speculation and curiosity that would not easily be stilled. The path ahead was uncharted, the approval of society uncertain, and the Duke himself bore responsibilities that could never be fully abandoned. Eleanor's heart fluttered, caught between elation and apprehension, the delicate balance of trust and propriety pressing upon her like the very weight of the sky. As they prepared to leave the stables, the Duke's hand brushed lightly against her elbow, guiding her toward the estate carriage. "We must move carefully," he murmured, voice resonant with both caution and promise. "The world may watch, but it will not dictate the bond we have forged here. Not if we are steadfast." Eleanor nodded, drawing in a deep, shivering breath, the cold mingling with anticipation, the faintest thrill of defiance coursing through her veins. She glanced toward the villagers, who now stared in a mixture of awe and whispered speculation, and felt the first flush of courage bloom. She would face them, not as a widow resigned to gossip, but as a woman whose worth had been acknowledged, whose courage had been seen, whose heart had begun to awaken. The carriage awaited, horses pawing at the frozen ground, their breath rising in clouds like fleeting promises. Eleanor stepped forward, guided by the Duke's hand, and as she ascended, a sudden movement caught her eye, a figure, partially obscured by the snow, watching from the tree line, their intent hidden, their purpose unknown. A cold shiver ran down her spine, mingling with the warmth that had begun to bloom in her chest. The Duke noticed her hesitation, but his expression remained calm, though a flicker of tension passed across his features. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, muffling the wind and leaving Eleanor with the echo of the figure in her mind. And as the carriage began its slow, deliberate journey along the frost-laden path, Eleanor felt the weight of anticipation, hope, and apprehension pressing upon her heart. The storm had passed, the night had yielded to possibility, yet even in the warmth of the Duke's presence, she understood that the path forward would demand courage beyond any she had yet known. And as the manor receded into the distance, snow glinting like shards of light in the early morning, Eleanor realized that the next challenge, the test of trust, of propriety, of the fragile bond forming between them, had already begun, waiting to reveal itself in ways she could neither foresee nor control. The wind rose suddenly, whipping across the open fields like a herald of change, scattering the last vestiges of snow across the countryside as Eleanor gripped the reins with steady hands, her heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves. The carriage rattled over the frozen ground, its wooden wheels echoing in the crisp morning, yet within her chest there was a storm far more potent than any winter gale. The manor lay behind them, distant yet still alive in her mind, the firelight of yesterday's warmth lingering like a memory, a promise of sanctuary now transformed into possibility. Beside her, the Duke's presence was unwavering, a constant of strength and quiet authority that made her shiver not from cold, but from the intensity of being truly seen, truly recognized. "Almost there," he murmured, voice low and deliberate, brushing her awareness with its warmth. "The estate grounds are secure, the villagers informed of your safe passage. There is no need for hesitation." Eleanor inclined her head, absorbing his words, feeling the tension of weeks, the weight of judgment, grief, and solitude, begin to ease. And yet, the uncertainty of the world beyond their temporary sanctuary still pressed upon her, subtle but insistent. She knew that acceptance of trust, of partnership, was one thing, maintaining it against the currents of society, against rumor and expectation, would demand courage anew. The carriage came to a slow halt at the edge of the Duke's northern estate, a place of quiet majesty, its gates wrought iron, etched with the family crest, glinting faintly in the morning light. Eleanor's breath caught as she beheld the expanse, stable sturdy and inviting, gardens carefully tended even beneath the frost, and the warmth of the manor itself, smoke curling gently from its chimneys, promising comfort and refuge. Her fingers tightened around the reins, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a life unburdened by the loneliness and despair that had defined her days. She glanced at the Duke, who observed her not with authority alone, but with an intimacy born of understanding and respect. "Shall we?" he asked, a single word heavy with implication, and she nodded, knowing that this small act, stepping onto his grounds, accepting his guidance, was itself a declaration. The horses moved steadily into the yard, stamping softly on the frozen ground, their breaths rising in clouds that mingled with the faint mist of morning. Eleanor dismounted with a grace born of habit, the Duke's gloved hand close but not overbearing, an anchor rather than a restraint. He guided her toward the stable where her own animals were now sheltered, their coats gleaming and warm, and she felt a swell of gratitude and relief that transcended mere survival. In that moment, she realized that care, courage, and trust were intertwined. The protection of her animals mirrored the protection offered to her own heart, fragile yet resilient. Inside the stable, the Duke's attentions were meticulous yet unobtrusive. He ensured the animals were fed and comfortable, guiding Eleanor's hands with quiet direction, never diminishing her agency, only supporting it. The trust between them had matured, like the careful tending of a delicate plant, and in every glance and gesture, Eleanor perceived the subtle bloom of affection, tempered by restraint, yet undeniable in its depth. She met his gaze for the first time without hesitation, and in that exchange, both recognized the unspoken bond forged through shared hardship and steadfast courage. The village beyond the gates had gathered once more, curious eyes pressing against fences and hedgerows, and Eleanor felt the familiar pulse of apprehension. Yet the Duke, perceptive and deliberate, did not waver. He called their attention with calm authority, his voice ringing clear across the crisp morning air. "These horses are tended, their mistress safe. Let there be no question of courage, nor of honor, nor of respect. This woman has faced adversity with a dignity unmatched, and it is your duty to acknowledge it, whether in admiration or silence." Eleanor's chest tightened as whispers rippled through the crowd, some shifted uncomfortably, others offered hesitant bows, the tide of judgment beginning to bend toward recognition, albeit slowly. They walked together then, Eleanor's hand brushing against the Duke's sleeve in a gesture that was neither accidental nor forward, but simply a connection of trust, a silent affirmation of partnership. The morning sun, pale yet penetrating, caught the edges of her hair and cloak, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to feel lightness, a fragile sense of belonging. The Duke's eyes lingered upon her, admiration tempered by deep respect, and Eleanor understood that their bond was neither fleeting nor superficial. It was a tether of courage, honesty, and recognition, tested by hardship and now resilient in its emergence. As they approached the manor, a sudden disturbance at the gates drew Eleanor's attention, a messenger, breathless, cloaked in travel dust, holding a folded letter sealed with wax. The Duke's expression shifted imperceptibly, a shadow passing across his otherwise composed demeanor. He took the letter, eyes scanning the seal and paper with careful precision, and Eleanor felt the familiar tremor of unease creep into her heart. What news could arrive at this moment, when trust was newly forged, and hope was fragile yet vital? The messenger bowed and departed silently, leaving only the soft crunch of snow beneath retreating boots, and Eleanor glanced at the Duke, sensing the weight of unspoken implications. He folded the letter slowly, deliberately, then turned to her, his eyes steady but thoughtful. "It appears," he said softly, voice measured yet tense, "that the world beyond these grounds will test us still. Responsibilities, expectations, matters of family and estate that cannot be ignored, even for matters of the heart." Eleanor felt her breath catch, but she did not flinch. The stakes had grown, true, yet the bond they had forged in storm, firelight, and quiet confession lent her courage. She nodded, understanding implicitly that love, like courage, required perseverance against forces both visible and unseen. The Duke extended his hand once more, not as an authority, not as a protector, but as an equal, inviting Eleanor into a partnership defined by trust and mutual respect. "Will you stand with me, Eleanor? Not merely for warmth, nor shelter, but for the life we might build, together, if the world allows." Her lips curved into a tentative, resolute smile, the first unguarded expression in months. "I will," she whispered, voice steady though her heart raced. "Not out of necessity, nor obligation, but because my heart chooses to trust you, to walk beside you, whatever awaits beyond these gates." A hush fell over the courtyard, the morning light glinting across frost and iron, a silence that seemed both reverent and infinite. For a moment, the world outside ceased to matter, the storm had passed, the villagers had witnessed courage and dignity, and Eleanor's heart, long encased in sorrow and propriety, began to thaw. The Duke's smile, rare and subtle, mirrored the fragile joy blooming within her, a promise of partnership, warmth, and trust that no storm, no rumor, no shadow could easily undo. Yet even as relief and hope swelled within her, Eleanor could not entirely dismiss the flicker of unease that lingered. The sealed letter, the messenger's haste, the unspoken expectations of nobility, all whispered of challenges yet to come, trials that could test their fragile union and the trust they had painstakingly nurtured. She cast a final glance toward the gates, snow glinting like shards of light upon iron, and felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with resolve. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in many months, she felt she would face it not alone, but hand in hand with someone who truly saw her, and whose presence could withstand the tempests of both storm and society. And as the manor doors opened to receive them once more, Eleanor's heart steady yet expectant, she understood that the journey of trust, courage, and love had only begun, and that the world beyond these walls held both the promise of joy and the inevitability of challenge, waiting to reveal itself in ways she had yet to imagine.